Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the first annual Chamberlain Legacy Lecture. I'm Larissa Vigu-Picard, Executive Director of Pejepscot History Center, which owns and operates the Joshua L. Chamberlain Museum. We have been looking forward to tonight for a very long time. Please be aware that we're recording this evening's event for posterity and to share after the fact with those who were unable to be here this evening. And in part, that's because of COVID and some out-of-state folks that were going to come. And that includes a generous sponsor of tonight's festivities, Doug Chamberlain, who is a descendant of a Chamberlain cousin, who helped make this possible. I also want to thank the hotel for working with us to put this on tonight, and Union Street Bakery, who baked a beautiful cake with a lovely Maltese cross on it that we will dig into after the presentation. I want to thank our great staff, Amy Keithan, our Museum Services Manager, Tori Levesque, our development manager, and the Pejepscot History Center board, several members of which are here tonight. If you are out there, if you could raise your hand, board members. I know there's a few of you here. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. And I also want to thank, in general, our amazing volunteers. We have one that's helped us at registration tonight, Marie Pangborn. And we also have a portion of our volunteers are our amazing docents of our two historic house museums, the Joshua Chamberlain Museum and the Schofield Whittier House. And we have several Joshua Chamberlain museums. We have several Chamberlain Museum docents here this evening who I have to give a special shout out to because they help tell the story of the amazing individual that we're here to talk and learn and honor tonight. And so if you are a Chamberlain Museum docent, if you could stand up, please, so that people will know who you are. And we thank you. These are the folks who get to tell the story again and again and again to our visitors from out of state, from away, and to folks from Maine who come to the museum. And we really appreciate all the hard work that they put into that role. Given where things are with the pandemic, I appreciate you abiding by our request to remain masked this evening as much as possible, which is according to CDC guidelines, unless you're taking a quick sip of a beverage, since we do have a lovely bar in the room. After the talk, we do have desserts, including the cake I mentioned, to share, and for that we ask that you just spread out as best you can. You're welcome to move your chairs into friendly groups, or also take your treats and your beverages out onto the patio, which is a lovely patio along Noble Street here. So many of you probably know that for many years we hosted a summer tradition called Chamberlain Days. This 3-day event took advantage of the growing popularity of Joshua Chamberlain in the 1990s. And of course, many people in modern memory came to know about Chamberlain from John Pullen's work earlier in the 20th Maine book he wrote that came out in the late 1950s. But really, of course, it was the Ken Burns era, as we kind of like to refer to it, and the Michael Shara era. Chamberlain Days was an annual event, then it was biannual, and it featured reenactors on the town green, multiple speakers, and a wide variety of other activities celebrating Chamberlain and his life. In 2019, the last time we held the event, it was consolidated to a single day, and it was a big success. However, after that, the decision was made by the PHC staff and board to transition to an annual major lecture series and reception held near Chamberlain's September 8th birthday. And he is 193 years old, as of 2 days ago. And so here we are at the Chamberlain Legacy Lecture. We could have just called it the Chamberlain Lecture, of course, but the word legacy connotes something very important to us. We wanted this to not be a lecture series only about Chamberlain during Chamberlain's time, or even solely about Chamberlain at all, but an opportunity to address issues with which Joshua Chamberlain or his family intersected, or that were important to him and them, or their society, and which are still important to us today. As we all know, Chamberlain was a polymath, a Renaissance man, with many interests, abilities, and experiences. He became involved in many aspects of 19th century and early 20th century society. Beyond the iconic subject areas of the Civil War, politics, and higher education are innumerable subtopics that one could, one way or another, tie back to him. Race, medicine, disability, suffering and grief, political division, civics and civil civil discourse, religion, rhetoric, languages, the fine arts, women's education and women's issues in general, capital punishment, Maine history, business, sailing, architecture, gardening, animals. One could go on endlessly, but you get the idea. In other words, Chamberlain's legacy in the world is extremely broad. We don't need to be limited by the most obvious subject areas or to only discussing the years he was alive. We can use him as a jumping-off point to talk about any number of subjects that are relevant to people today. We were fortunate to find a fresh voice to help us launch this fresh take on Joshua Chamberlain. I found out about Kanisorn, Wongsrichanalai, somewhat by accident, a very happy accident. He gave a talk on Zoom for the Bowdoin Library's Special Collections Division earlier this year, and during that I discovered, thrillingly, that he not only was a dynamic, captivating speaker, but that he had a very special place in his heart for Joshua Chamberlain. I will let him tell you more about that, and in a moment, the PHC Board President Shannon Gilmore will tell you more about him, but know that we feel we found the perfect person to kick off this new lecture series, honor Joshua Chamberlain, and share his relevance with a contemporary audience. Before I turn this over to Shannon to introduce Kid, as he is more familiarly known, we have a very special welcome that we want to share with you. And this is a great example of ask and ye shall receive.
Good evening to PHC members, supporters, friends, Chamberlain enthusiasts, and history lovers. I wish I could be with you tonight to kick off the first annual Chamberlain Legacy Lecture and to celebrate Joshua Chamberlain's life in all its richness and depth. Nearly 40 years ago, I read a novel called The Killer Angels. It told the story of three of the most important days in American history: Gettysburg, the greatest battle ever fought in the Americas. But what was most important to me about the book was that it introduced me for the first time to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And for all intents and purposes, it was the life of Chamberlain that convinced me to embark on one of the most difficult and satisfying experiences of my professional life. It is my belief that Chamberlain represents the best kind of history, rich, complicated, even contradictory. His is the story, though, which usually gets overlooked in the superficial aerial views of history we are usually presented with. He enlivens, though, page after page of our past, as we learn first of his early life as a professor at Bowdoin, then as the very green colonel of the 20th Maine, finally as a hero at Fredericksburg, Petersburg, and Gettysburg, especially Gettysburg, where on Little Round Top he executes an obscure textbook maneuver that saves the Union Army and quite possibly the Union itself. For many years and some generations after the war, Chamberlain's story was overlooked, the actions of this citizen hero for the most part forgotten. That is the way it is in history. Many worthwhile events and people get lost in the interpretive shuffle, and it takes a new generation, a later generation, to rescue and save that which it finds important. I find Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain important. Joshua Chamberlain's story is one of many layers. In addition to his service to the Union Army, he was also a statesman, a husband and father, a musician, a researcher, an orator, and at heart, a scholar and educator. He was a leader that many people continue to hold in the highest esteem. He was also a flawed human being who experienced failure and pain, and who was not always fair or right. But while he was a Victorian man of his time, he was often able to look beyond it, whether it was promoting the education of women or finding ways to keep young people in the state of Maine after the Civil War. Chamberlain's story and legacy did not end with his death. It is echoing still through our history, continually sharing its lessons with us. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few moments with you tonight. Enjoy the keynote presentation.
So now I'm going to ask our board president, Shannon Gilmore, to come up to the podium, and she's right here.
Hello. There are a lot of people here. Thank you all for coming. I was delighted to be asked to introduce Dr. Kanisorn Wongsrichanalai tonight for a few reasons. First, I'm excited about kicking off the Chamberlain Legacy Lecture. And second, I've admired his work for a long time, since we were both students at Bowdoin College. And there was one whole year when about once a week you could find me sitting in the student union with the student paper splayed in front of me, and I was reading his very long weekly series on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And it was amazing. It was like Joshua Chamberlain part 21, Joshua Chamberlain part 22. And what was astounding about this, it was good. What was astounding about it is this was another student who was also a history major in my department, not in my class, who had the time and the skills and the ability to do research and writing outside of his regular course load. That just amazed me. And second, astounding was that his passion for the subject, his interest in history, and his ability to tell the stories of the past came through in his writing. And I know that he's like kind of mortified that I brought that up, but this is something I've been thinking about ever since I knew he was coming to campus. It's very cool. So after Bowdoin, Kidd went to UVA and completed his dissertation, which then became a book, and it's called, Larissa's taller than me. It was called Northern Character, listen closely, Northern Character, College-Educated New Englanders Honor, Nationalism, and Leadership in the Civil War Era. Is there another person who would be more perfect to deliver this lecture tonight? Armed with his PhD, he went on to teach at East Tennessee State University and Angelo State University in Texas, where he co-led a project involving the chronicle of West Texan personal accounts of war involvement since World War I. This project led to the collection of media, documents, and oral histories, which I found online through a basic Google search, and it was super cool, and I encourage you all to check it out later if you haven't already. That project was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Since 2019, Dr. Wongsrichanalai has been the Director of Research at the Masschusetts Historical Society. And apart from those biographical details, I also want you to know that when I Googled him, one of the things that came through loud and clear was on ratemyprofessors.com, where all of his students, review after review, said, "This professor is awesome. He makes lectures interesting. He keeps me awake at 8 a.m. I have no interest in history, except I really like his class." All of that just came through student after student. So I know that he will have interesting things to share with us tonight. He'll keep us awake. And I also know that he sometimes does surprise quizzes, so just be ready. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kanisorn Wongsrichanalai.
Okay. Well, it was quite a welcome. Thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Larissa, and thank you all of you for coming out this lovely evening in Brunswick, Maine. It's great to be back. I first came to Brunswick in the spring of 1998, and my first stop, I was on a campus tour. We were looking at Bowdoin and the other colleges in Maine that need not be mentioned here. But my first stop was not the Bowdoin campus. My first stop was the Chamberlain House. Actually, we were, I think, staying in Portland, and I called ahead, and I said, "I want to see a statue of Joshua Chamberlain. There must be a statue to Joshua Chamberlain." They had not put the statue up yet. In fact, they did not put the statue up until after I graduated from Bowdoin. And I was disappointed that there was no statue. Anyway, I went into the museum, and I went into the bookstore, and I wanted to purchase a portrait, particularly this portrait right here. So this is Chamberlain in 1862 as a lieutenant colonel. Now, they had sold out of the print, and I convinced them to sell me the one that was on display, and I took this to my college interview at Bowdoin, and I was cradling it. I said, this is so cool. I got this one. And then I had it framed, and you will see that the person who framed it did not quite understand that I wanted him to cut it out of the plastic and frame just the portrait, but instead he has framed here everything that's listed, which includes the Pejepscot Historical Society, the old name for this. Photograph available, it says, $10. So this is here. So it is, of course, a thrill to be back here, a great honor to kick off this lecture series. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Colonel, 34. He prefers to be called Lawrence, a professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College, sometimes professor of natural and revealed religion, successor to the chair of the famed Professor Stowe, husband to Harriet Beecher. Tall and rather handsome, attractive to women, somewhat boyish, a clean and charming person, an excellent student, Phi Beta Kappa. He speaks 7 languages and has a beautiful singing voice. But he has always wanted his entire life to be a soldier. The college will not free him for war, but in the summer of 1862, he requests a sabbatical for study in Europe. When it is granted, he proceeds not to France, but to the office of the governor of Maine, where he receives a commission in the 20th Regiment, Maine, Infantry Maine Volunteers, and marches off to war with a vast faith in the brotherhood of man. These were the very first words I read about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain as a high school student. The passage, of course, is from Michael Shara's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel from 1974 of the Battle of Gettysburg, The Killer Angels. The novel inspired, among others, Ken Burns, who you saw here, whose 1989 PBS series, along with Ron Maxwell's film, Gettysburg, based on Shara's novel, summoned Chamberlain from the cacophony of history and introduced us to him, and introduced him to, in his own words, generations that know us not and that we know not of. I would be remiss without mentioning that part of the revival of Chamberlain's career was due to Brunswick's own John Pullen, a wonderful historian whose 1957 book about the 20th Maine was an inspiration for Michael Shara. When I first learned about Chamberlain then, this was in the late 1990s, it was at the height of this great wave, this great cacophony of love for the general. He was everywhere. And anyone who knew anything about the Civil War, a passing understanding of the Civil War, knew his name. He was that popular. Ken Burns has written that Shara's novel literally changed my life. He's praised Chamberlain as the best kind of American, representing the best of history. He repeated some of that in the video here. Why? What is so appealing about Joshua Chamberlain? A short listing of his biography is useful here to to reveal the ascendance of his career as well as the trajectory of his life. There was a time when I first started teaching that many of the students in class had read The Killer Angels, had known who Joshua Chamberlain was. Then later on, fewer and fewer hands went up and fewer people knew who he was. So it's useful to just sort of remind folks of what he's done. He's born in Brewer, Maine in 1828. He's a member of the Bowdoin class of 1852, and then goes off to the Bangor Theological Seminary, returns to Bowdoin as a professor. And when the Civil War begins, he sees his students become soldiers, march off to war, and he longs to join them. And he gets that chance the next year in 1862. He becomes the lieutenant colonel of the 20th Maine, and he learns a lot about the military arts from a West Point trained officer, Adelbert Ames, another Mainer, and one who deserves some interest from the historical community. He's a really great individual. Assuming command of the 20th Maine before the Battle of Gettysburg, on the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg, Chamberlain finds his unit positioned on the extreme left position, the left flank of the United States Army, on a slope of a hill called Little Round Top. This is the 2nd of July, 1863. Determined attack by Confederates pressure this position for numerous hours, holding them off, but then running low on ammunition. The unit, the Mainers, attack, rush down the hillside and sweep the attackers before them, winning the day, saving the United States Army. And for his actions, Chamberlain receives the Congressional Medal of Honor. But his military career did not end at Gettysburg. 1 year later, at the battle, or in one of the many battles outside of Petersburg, Virginia, a bullet hit Chamberlain through the right hip and cut through his body, moving through his body, crushing his bones and cutting into his bladder and urethra. Not wanting to have his men see him fall, he pulls out his sword from his scabbard, sticks it in the ground, and holds himself up until all his men have rushed by, at which point he collapses onto the ground and bleeds out into the Virginia soil. They think the wound is mortal. This is one of the many times that they announce his death in the papers. The surgeons don't think he's going to live. General Ulysses Grant gives him a battlefield promotion to brigadier general for this. But somehow he survives. And after surviving his Petersburg wound, Chamberlain returns to the front and is on hand as the United States Army of the Potomac finally corners the rebel army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. The Union High Command then selects Chamberlain to receive the official surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. And when the Confederate troops are marching up, led by General John Gordon of the Army of Northern Virginia, Chamberlain surprises them by ordering a salute to these people who have been trying to kill him for the past 4 years, these rebels. And they're stunned, and they respond. Gordon responds by ordering a salute himself. This is honor, honoring honor. This is what Chamberlain writes about. And this moment is viewed as the start of the long reconciliation process between the two sides, these two bitter enemies that had fought so hard against each other. After the rebellion was suppressed, the citizens of Maine sent Joshua Chamberlain to the governor's desk for 4 terms. These are 4 single-year terms. So if you can imagine a constant campaign, that's really quite remarkable that he's able to maintain such popularity for so long. Chamberlain then returns to Bowdoin as president and attempts to modernize the institution, this institution that he loved so dearly. He became a much sought-after lecturer for his remarkable wordsmithing skills and his ability to conjure the past and help to paint vivid images in the minds of his audiences. Chamberlain passed away in 1914, just a few months before the Great War broke out. Now that is an inspiring biography and a remarkable life. Thanks to Pullen, Shara, Burns, and Maxwell, Chamberlain fever hit with a mighty force in the 1990s. Now, one scholar who has studied modern depictions of Civil War art noticed, quote, nearly invisible in art before the 1980s, Joshua Chamberlain dominates all his comrades in arms, including John Buford, Winfield Scott Hancock, and John Reynolds. Now, these are high-ranking Union soldiers at the Battle of Gettysburg. He dominates them all. Within the overall genre of artworks devoted to Northern themes, Chamberlain boasts more than twice as many pieces as Grant, 5 times the number of William Tecumseh Sherman, Philip Henry Sheridan, George McClellan, George Meade. These are all major commanders of Union armies during the Civil War. They paint Joshua Chamberlain. Or really, they paint Jeff Daniels, who portrays Chamberlain in the movie, who looks more like him. Moreover, he is by far the most painted Union commander in the 5 major books by artists Don Troiani, Mort Kunstler, John Paul Strain, Keith Rocco, and Dale Gallen. His 24 images exceed the combined total of Winfield Hancock, Ulysses Grant, John Buford, and John Reynolds, the next 4 most painted officers. Chamberlain's everywhere. But the Chamberlain that came back from the past and graced Civil War art galleries and T-shirts and television screens across the nation was a romanticized and mythologized version of the real man. His rough edges had been smoothed away. His imperfections had been covered over by imperfect knowledge about him. When Americans of the late 20th century rediscovered Joshua Chamberlain, they discovered a symbol and a hero, a vessel in whom they could see what they wanted to see about themselves, about their society, about who they had become, and about who they wanted to be. They imbued him with all of these traits and characteristics that they found most noble and appealing. Here was the embodiment of the North. Here was the very model of Northern manhood who saved the United States Army, who freed the enslaved people, who preserved America as we know it. And in so doing, opened the door to all the remarkable achievements that the United States was able to accomplish in the 20th century, seemingly justifying its birth and its rank among the nations of the earth. They made him a legend. He was a man from the North whose character had been forged by hard winters, whose ideals had been strengthened by enduring the unrelenting cold, whose nobility was as tall as the pines of Maine, and whose resolution was as immovable as the surf-hammered rocky shoals of his native state. What did he stand for? Well, those who only had a cursory understanding of him filled him with all of their ideals. He was for the preservation of the United States, of course. He must have been an abolitionist whose commitment to the ideal of freedom must have equaled the patriotism that inspired him to march off in the name of the Republic. He must have, in the years after the war, stood up for all that was righteous, welcoming back those who had fought against him across the bloody chasm, creating a just world for those whose chains had been broken by the war, and inspiring the gaze of all who came after as this pinnacle of health and manhood, whose scars had been healed, whose eyes remained firmly fixed on the ideals that had inspired him in the nation's darkest hour and carried him through its darkest trial. The modern discovery of Chamberlain celebrated his heroism, but also greatly emphasized his role in bringing the two sides together after the war. Now, Chamberlain's gesture to John Gordon at Appomattox Courthouse set the stage for this future reconciliation between the two sides. In 1901, for example, a newspaper in Raleigh, North Carolina, published a letter that Chamberlain sent in response to a North Carolina resident by the name of Eaton. Now, this Mr. Eaton had felt compelled to write the Maine general after reading about an incident that took place at Appomattox. In this incident, a rebel color bearer, as he was about to surrender the tattered remnant of the flag that he had been responsible for carrying through the war, burst into tears at the sight of United States troops. "Boys," this color bearer supposedly said, "boys, this is not the first time you have seen that flag. I have borne it in the front of the battle on many a victorious field, and I had rather die than surrender it now." To this, Chamberlain reportedly responded, "Brave fellow, I admire your noble spirit, and only regret that I have not the authority to bid you keep your flag and carry it home as a precious heirloom." Eaton was taken by this. This is why he wrote Chamberlain. And he concluded his letter to Chamberlain by wishing him that in the decline of your life you have health and comfort, and that after you answer the last roll call here, your chivalrous soul may find repose in the Valhalla of the brave. They had a way with words in the 19th century. In his response, Chamberlain claimed to have remembered this very incident, explaining, "For it was the last flag surrendered there, and it came in borne by a little remnant of a regiment which had recently, I think, had been acting as a headquarters guard, and therefore came in late to the ceremony after being relieved from that detail." The poor fellows, or I would rather say the noble fellows, clung to that old flag, battle-smoked and blood-stained, as if it were dearer than life to them, dear as manhood and honor. I felt their feeling and had said something like you have quoted. Chamberlain then recalled his salute to Gordon and the surrendering Confederates, and noted having received their salute in response. Was this not a grand feature of this last meeting in arms of two historic armies? Chamberlain mused. So taken by this response, Eaton concluded his letter to the editor, letter to the paper. He wrote, "Who, Mr. Editor, can doubt the stability of the Republic when that mighty civil conflict failed to destroy it? Who can doubt that its destiny is safe under the guidance of the descendants of the immortal Lee and of that generous, high-souled soldier, Joshua L. Chamberlain of Maine?" So here, in 1901, a Southerner, writing about an incident from the war that had denied his section its desired independence, was comparing Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain to Robert Edward Lee, the Confederacy's great war chief. Why? Should the Confederacy's war hero, Robert E. Lee, not have been compared to the loyal American soldier who defeated him, Ulysses Grant? To answer this question, we need to understand the process of reconciliation, capital R, which was dominant in the decades leading up to the 50th anniversary of the Civil War in the 19 teens. Reconciliation refers to the process by which soldiers who fought for the United States and those who fought for the Confederate States, as well as others as well, embraced each other to celebrate the bravery of white manhood on the field of battle. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was another instance, another important moment for reconciliation, when a united nation had a common foe to fight against. And this, again, also was in the background of what was happening, which was Civil War veterans from both the North and the South were publishing their memoirs, their recollections of the conflict around this time. This reconciliation process, of course, was a positive step for sectional peace. But what was the cost? The price the Americans paid for sectional peace and reconciliation was the civil rights of the freed people. Many Northerners, Chamberlain included, accepted that race relations would be managed by local governments, and that meant the mass disenfranchisement of African American voters as a host of Jim Crow laws and restrictions that muffled their voices for a century went into effect. Both Grant and Lee had passed away by the time reconciliation came along, but one might find it odd that the man who stood for the presidency with the slogan, "Let us have peace," the very words that are etched onto his mausoleum in Riverside Park in New York City, is not remembered alongside the man who fought to try to destroy the United States, to break it apart. If Grant had ended his career as a Civil War general, maybe he would have been remembered more fondly by the time reconciliation came along. The problem, of course, was that Grant had become president, and as president had used his military might to attempt to enforce the civil rights laws that Congress had passed during this period of Reconstruction. And for using the army to combat terrorist groups in the South and attempting to protect the freed people. Now, Grant, of course, has this great affinity for the African American soldiers who made up 10% of his army by the time he won the Civil War. He had this great affinity for it. He understood that the nation owed them something. And so he used his power to try to protect their rights. He tried to protect those who were loyal to the United States, more so than those who had tried to tear it asunder. Those at the forefront of reconciliation, therefore, sidelined Grant. The war, in the minds of reconciliationists, had been about the bravery of white males. They consciously avoided the contentious issues of the past and celebrated what united them. Chamberlain became the stand-in for the United States military leadership and the acceptable Northerner, whose gentlemanly behavior made him a fixture of the reconciliationist movement. When Chamberlain's memory came back in the 1990s, in the 1980s and the 1990s, those who rediscovered him also hailed his role in reconciliation and healing the wounds of the nation. Indeed, if you remember from the 1989 series, Ken Burns ends on this note of reconciliation. He's very much taken by this myth of Chamberlain, part of this myth of reconciliation. So as the 1990s brought newfound recognition to Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, it also introduced him to modern historians. And in looking at Chamberlain with a critical eye, scholars quickly came to unearth the man behind the myth. They found the rough edges, revealed his flaws, and tarnished his heroic luster. So what parts of Chamberlain's myth have not withstood historical scrutiny? Well, first and foremost, he was no abolitionist, nor was he enlightened on the issues of race. Just because he may have heard early drafts of Uncle Tom's Cabin while he was a student at Bowdoin, that did not make him an abolitionist. He's from a conservative Democratic family in Maine. It's not clear when he broke with his father's party and whatnot, but like most people in the North, he would not have gone to war to destroy slavery. But he did believe that the war was worth it for preserving the Union. And when Lincoln fused the goals of saving the Union and destroying slavery together, Chamberlain thought that that was a necessity. It was right, and it was a necessity. After the war, of course, he accepted the nomination of Lincoln's party for the governorship here in Maine. The Democrats, his father's party, and perhaps a party that he had supported in the past, had been linked to insurrection and supporting the rebellion, and that was a step too far for Chamberlain and for a whole generation of soldiers. But Chamberlain was not a Republican on all issues, and he was certainly not a political tool. His disagreements and breaks with the Republican Party leadership in this state, particularly James Blaine, a very powerful politician, ultimately prevented him from rising in the ranks of the party to become a U.S. Senator, a position that he greatly coveted. The modern myth of Chamberlain so desperately wanted him to be the embodiment of all that was good in the war, or at least what late 20th century Americans thought was good about the war. But myths cannot contend with reality, and the truth is that Chamberlain valued sectional peace and conservative government probably over the civil rights of the freed people. Part of the reason for his stance is due to the fact that he harbored the same prejudices as 19th century individuals did. After the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox, Chamberlain found himself and his men in control of this region of Middle Virginia. And he considered the nature of this assignment challenging in its own right, ensuring the peace and whatnot. But he singled out the freed people for causing chaos. So here's Chamberlain writing about this moment. We found the Negroes especially unruly. All restraints which had hitherto held them in check were set loose by the sudden collapse of the rebel armies. The floodgates were opened to the rush of animal instinct. The only notion of freedom apparently entertained by these bewildered people was to do as they pleased. That was what they had reason to suppose white men did. To act according to each one's nature was liberty, contrasted with slavery. Numbers gave them a kind of frenzy. Without accustomed support, without food or opportunity to work, they not unnaturally banded together. And without any serious organization and probably without much deliberation, plotting of evil. They still spread terror over the country. They swarmed through houses and homes, demanding food, abusing the weak, terrifying women, and threatened to burn and destroy. This was an evil that had to be met promptly, and we construed our orders to protect the country liberally. Listen to that description. This master of rhetoric, this eloquent speaker, used powerfully prejudicial words to describe people who had just been freed by the war. Chamberlain's view of the issue of race continued to influence his beliefs during the Reconstruction period, and this explains partly his break with the Republican Party during his governorship and after. He celebrated the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, who had, when he was campaigning, promised to withdraw United States troops from southern capitals, thereby ending Reconstruction in the states, the last states with democratically elected governments. Hayes, sworn in after a contentious election in 1877, kept his promise and did just that. And with that, Reconstruction ended. This led to what was known as the redemption of the South. That is, the return to home rule of the very people, the former Southerners who had held power before the war. Now, at the end of Reconstruction, they are back in charge as well. Chamberlain wrote to the President's Secretary of the Interior, Carl Schurz, noting, quote, "Though firm in his adherence to the great principles of the Republican Party, I still believe in the purification of the civil service, a constant regard for local government, self-government, and the subordination of the military to the civil power in a time of peace. Now, this last one is a criticism of General Grant, President Grant, who prior to this had used the military to sustain the governments in the South. And this clearly signaled his greater interest in sectional peace and reunion over the rights of African Americans who had won their rights as a result of the war and the battles of Reconstruction. At the turn of the 20th century, as Jim Crow laws were strengthened around the country, Chamberlain wrote to a former U.S. representative from Georgia, a man named William Fleming, who had just given a speech that argued that slavery had had a negative impact on the South. So he actually accepted the results of the war, the defeat in the war. But he still supported segregation. And Chamberlain expressed his high appreciation of the noble spirit of this utterance and the true statesmanship evinced in the handling of a difficult political problem, by which he meant racial segregation. Chamberlain admitted that a most difficult practical problem is now laid upon our people of the South, the solution of which, as well as the consequences of it, must be mainly undertaken and borne by them, and the sympathy and cooperation of the people of the North should be cordially extended to them. The race issue, in short, was a Southern issue, and Northerners need not interfere. A cynic might look at this and point to the fact that this is the same reasoning that motivated those who compromised with slavery in the lead up to the Civil War. As one of our greatest living historians of abolition explains, quote, "It is worth remembering that in this instance, moderation and compromise-minded politics represented by the Compromise of 1877 resulted in the abandonment of Southern freedmen to the tender mercies of sore losers. Indeed, the tawdry history of compromise in 19th century America, from the Missouri Compromise to the compromises of 1850 and 1877, illustrates that compromise over slavery and civil rights always came at the expense of black lives and bodies. There was nothing moderate or statesmanlike about supporting the enslavement of African Americans before the war, or turning a blind eye to the pogroms against them in the South after the war. So if you are looking for a hero on racial issues, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is not your man. He is out of step with our contemporary society and what our contemporary society seeks in heroes. Let me be clear. Chamberlain was no supporter of slavery, and he acknowledged that the enslaved had done a great service to help the United States in the war. He knew that the country owed them freedom. But as he knew, and as you know, freedom does not mean equality. We should not expect that Chamberlain, a man from Maine who grew up in a conservative democratic family, would have much sympathy for the freed people. Emancipation, because it had helped save the United States from dismemberment, had been acceptable. But after the salvation of the United States had been achieved, after slavery had been destroyed, Chamberlain was content to revert back to his belief that states should deal with social problems. But if we cannot expect that Chamberlain should express a concern for the plight of the freed people, we do expect him to care for veterans. And he did. He belonged to numerous veterans organizations. He headed some of them. He spoke on behalf of veterans issues all the time, all around the country, and always had a special place in his heart for those who fought with him in the War of the Rebellion. But he could have done more. Indeed, Chamberlain, the man described as having the soul of the lion, was rather restrained in his fashion when it came to advocating for more benefits for veterans. How do we know that he was aware that there was more suffering than met the eye? Because he himself suffered in silence for decades after his own devastating wound. As historian Sarah Hanley Cousins has recently written in what I think is the best work on Chamberlain in years, Chamberlain suffered a great deal in the decades after his 1864 wounding. Here's Dr. Hanley Cousins. Hidden beneath his blue uniform and fine suits, the wound from Petersburg quietly tortured Chamberlain. Because of the damage to his urethra, he had temporarily required a catheter after he was wounded. Friction from the catheter had created a fistula that never healed. It leaked urine and left him susceptible to chronic bladder and testicular infections that caused him, in his words, unspeakable pain, unspeakable agony. A surgery in 1883 attempted to close this fistula. Chamberlain barely survived. Over the next 30 years, recurring infections plagued the general's self-described weak spot, often incapacitating him. When he died in 1914, it was of an infection of the old wound. Chamberlain was a casualty of war. It just had taken him 50 years to die. If he knew about the hidden pain of war personally, what could have kept him from doing all that he could for fellow soldiers who were likewise suffering in silence? Well, Chamberlain, who lived by the code of gentlemanly behavior, was restrained by these codes of conduct at the time. Chamberlain's Petersburg wound could be hidden, could be concealed, could be kept private in order for him to maintain this image of the virile and victorious northern man, returned from war not as a crippled individual by the conflict, but someone whom the conflict made whole. Chamberlain was not the only person to behave in this manner. Indeed, the majority of Civil War veterans who suffered wounds during the war had no visible scars that could be seen with the naked eye, either hidden under clothing or because they were psychological in nature and therefore misunderstood in the 19th century. Professor Hanley Cousins, again, quote, "Despite chronic pain and recurring illness, Chamberlain was committed to appearing and acting as able-bodied as possible. He lived with the pain and relied on sheer willpower to continue working. His strict work ethic, coupled with a body that appeared outwardly whole and healthy, deflected attention away from his disability." We do not often think of Joshua Chamberlain as a man with disability. We cannot fault the general, of course, for his behavior. He had the every right to keep his disability hidden. But what might he have done for those who suffered in their own way if he had made his own weakness public rather than uphold this image of the hale and hearty returning warrior? So the Chamberlain of legend and myth, the one who returned to us as the 19th century Cincinnatus, who came home and seemingly lived this life happily ever after, was himself in many ways a caricature, a character portrayed convincingly by the general, who was as much a captive of the 19th century dictates of manhood as an exemplar of them. Historians who have looked at Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and picked his life apart with forensic precision have certainly chipped away at this myth and revealed a man of contradictions, weaknesses, and prejudices. They revealed that he was not an ideal and perfect man. They have revealed him instead to be a man, simply human, like all the great mythical characters of our own history, that they are ultimately human. And in peeling back the layers of the Chamberlain myth, historians have shown that we, in our own time, seeking a perfect hero, have yet to find one. For perfection in man, or a nation, or a union, is a process that is constantly in motion. We are constantly seeking to better ourselves. We are constantly seeking to make a more perfect union. We may look to the past for heroes and saviors, but as our greatest modern poet-artist reminds us, lost souls search for saviors, but saviors don't last long. So what are we to make of the Chamberlain that has been revealed to us by scholarly insight? On the 20th of October, 1887, Chamberlain wrote a letter to his daughter, Grace, from New York, and this accompanied the gift of a sapphire that he had sent her. This is what he wrote. I have an impression that you fancy the sapphire. I therefore had one placed between diamonds. For the sapphire, though deep and rich, needs, like some other precious gems I know of, to be set in the midst of lights, to show its own beauty best. Things that are sufficient to themselves inspire our admiration, but those that need others win and hold our love. Accept this little token of my grateful appreciation for your goodness to your mother and to me when we needed such light and love. Things that are sufficient to themselves inspire our admiration. The same can be said of the Chamberlain of myth and legend. But those that need others win and hold our love. That can be said of the Chamberlain that the historians have revealed. His complexity, his contradictions, his suffering, his perfections make him a much more compelling historical figure. He is the sapphire set amongst the diamonds. His is the life set amongst others to show his beauty best. Here was a man of the 19th century who, within the context of his times, achieved wonders, inspires us to achieve wonders, to push the limits of endurance, to reach for the greatness beyond ourselves, and always, always to do one's duty. You asked me to speak about why Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain still matters today. Well, certainly he still matters for the example he set in his life. There are these inspiring qualities of the citizen who answered his country's call when the time was dark. A leader who, despite illness and mortal danger, remained cool in order to inspire his troops. The victorious warrior who showed mercy and treated his enemies with dignity. The thinker who championed modernization and education as the hope and the salvation of the world. Education. Those are easy to point out as to why Chamberlain still matters. But I want to highlight two other points that seem particularly useful for us in our own fraught times. What is the antidote to a time when a nation is fractured and divided? Well, Chamberlain, who lived through another era where America was fractured and divided, would say that serving a cause, serving society, and finding a cause to serve with all one's heart is one way to break the depression of crippling inertia, channeling oneself into a cause for the betterment of society, to be at the forefront of where one can be of the greatest good to the greatest number of people, is to show by doing. Chamberlain once wrote, "I owe the world some better service, and it is my duty to seek it." Many times after his wartime exploits, Chamberlain volunteered himself for service in the armed forces of the United States or others as well. In 1870, he wrote to the King of Prussia and tendered the best service of my sword. When war broke out with Spain in 1898, he wrote to the Secretary of War and tendered to the government, in the exigencies of the impending war, my services in any military capacity for which I may be deemed qualified. Now, some may read this as a rather pathetic attempt of an old soldier to try to get back in the action and recapture the thrill of his youth. But there is something noble and endearing and unyielding here. Yes, Chamberlain was a restless warrior who sought military glory. Such was the fate of many soldiers for whom the most exciting and potentially consequential events of their lives took place when they were young men. But there is an earnest here that cannot be denied. There is a lesson that we should all seek to find the place where we can do the most good for the greatest number. And in so doing, even if the light seems not so bright and to cast not so far a circle into a world of darkness, one ought to do that. As Chamberlain explained to Senator William Fry of Maine during the Spanish-American War, "I cannot but think that my day is not yet over for the service of my country. You gentlemen in Congress and in the offices of the government are in your right places. I desire to be in mine." Finally, one last lesson from Chamberlain for our times. And for this lesson, we return to reconciliation. Until the Petersburg wound took his life 50 years after he suffered it, Chamberlain always maintained that those who fought against him, from Fredericksburg to Appomattox, were suffering brothers. Chamberlain celebrated the bravery of those who fought so desperately and tenaciously against him for years. But the romance of reconciliation that bleached away the heat and anger of war and crafted these imperfect memories of an idealized past in the minds of so many Americans did not affect Chamberlain's perception of what was right and what was wrong. Chamberlain never forgot what the Confederacy stood for. He never forgot what the Confederates fought for. And what's more important, he never let them forget. In that sense, he was every bit the historian whose compass points to true north, to truth, to standing by the truth. Such was true of both his ideas pertaining to small incidences of the war and larger events as well. When the colonel of the Alabama regiment that fought him at Little Round Top wanted to erect a monument to the Alabama soldiers at Gettysburg there, and proposed a site. He proposed a site that Chamberlain thought was beyond where the rebels had advanced on that day. And he responded, "I should feel no objection to the erection of a monument to the honor of a regiment that had pushed its way so far around the flank of the Union line and made so gallant an attack. But I should expect it to be placed on ground where it actually stood at some time during the battle, and the extreme point of its advance, if desired, so that it might not only represent the valor of a regiment, but the truth of history. On the issues that caused the war and the fault of the rebellious states, Chamberlain never wavered. 1 year after Appomattox, he wrote to a Maine veteran, "If this war has taught any one lesson more imperatively than another, it is that we should be slow to trust those who have been disloyal to the country, and that we should do justice to those who stood by her in the hour of danger and trial. It seems little else than absolute madness to hasten to reinvest with political power the very men who precipitated upon us the horrors of civil war, and little less than cowardly wickedness to turn our backs upon the millions whose humble and despised condition did not prevent them from befriending the country when it was most in need of friends. And yet, this very madness and this very wickedness constitute today the main features of a policy urged upon the country with the full strength of the party which, pretending to oppose the war during its continuance, did in reality encourage and prolong it by a moral support. And now that the war is ended in a triumph so contrary to their predictions, seeks to rob that victory of the fruits we have supposedly secured." And at the dedication of Maine monuments in Gettysburg, Chamberlain made clear where he always stood. There is a phrase abroad which obscures the legal and the moral questions involved in the issue, indeed, which falsifies history: the war between the states. There are here no states outside of the Union. Resolving themselves out of it does not release them. No one of us would disregard the manly qualities and earnest motives among those who permitted themselves to strike at the consecrated life of the Union and thus made themselves our foes. But the best of virtues may be enlisted in the worst of causes. He would honor the men who fought against him, but he could never forget or let anyone forget the cause for which they were willing to die. As the wave of Civil War remembrances flooded the nation at the turn of the 20th century, during this rising tide of reconciliation, a tide that Chamberlain seemingly swam against, he noticed this distortion of the past to serve political ends, different ends. And he complained about it. He wrote, "There is a tendency nowadays to make history subserve other purposes than legitimate ones. The whole truth is sometimes quite different in its bearings from what is called truth. But to make a part truth displace the whole is not in accordance with old-fashioned ethics. You ask me why Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain matters? Because truth matters. Because truth still matters. Indeed, truth matters more now than it ever has. When the tools of deception deployed by those who would pervert history are used so effectively to cloak treason or insurrection in different garb and call it by a different name. But treason is treason. Insurrection is insurrection. Seceding to form a government and waging war against the United States is treason. Rejecting the outcome of a free and fair election, whether in 1860 or at any other time, is seditious behavior. And as Chamberlain demonstrated, one must never forget that although countrymen ought to love each other, there is right and there is wrong, and we should never lose sight of this irrefutable truth or undeniable fact. And because he remained true to his belief, and because he teaches us that we ought all to seek a place where we can do the most good for the most people in our society, in our world, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain still matters. On the 8th of September, 1887, on his 59th birthday, Joshua Chamberlain wrote to his mother, "This is my birthday, and I must write you my letter, as I always do, to bless and thank you for my life, for all your suffering, for me and tender care and faithful guidance and good instruction. I trust I have made the life of some good to the world and a joy to you. Perhaps I have not made all that was possible of my life, but I trust God has still use for me and has spared me through so many perils and so many years for a blessing somewhere yet to be given and received." On this occasion of what would have been the General's 193rd birthday, I think we can all agree that he did indeed make the life of some good to the world. By his ideals, his character, his actions, and his commitment to truth, he inspired and continues to inspire us with his deeds undiminished and his spirit still marching on. Thank you. Master of Ceremonies.
I hope this, good, it does work. We have a few minutes for questions.
I grew up in Brewer, so of course I love Joshua Chamberlain as well. I'm curious, though, about how his theology impacted his ideas about segregation and desegregation.
That's a very good question. I'm looking forward to Ron White's new book that will come out the next couple of years. He's absolutely right that that's something that, that scholars have not looked at before. I'm afraid I cannot really answer the question, but he might be able to soon.
We had a wonderful presentation here, and Kid is going to obviously be around. We have books, his book for sale out in the hallway. If you're interested in that, I'm sure he'd be willing to sign.
Sure, and portraits are $10, right? And they're still sold.
I should
The
have
price has
brought
gone up.
some of those.
Yeah.
We do have a cake, and we're going to cut that in just a minute. And they will be bringing in some desserts. You're welcome to get another beverage. And please join us for a little bit of festivity and reception. And happy birthday, Joshua. And thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation for this first Chamberlain Legacy Lecture. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.